Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into a really powerful critique that questions the very foundations of Vaishnavism, which, as you know, is one of Hinduism's major traditions. We're going to explore some serious challenges to its sacred texts, its logic, and even its sources of truth.
So, first things first, let's make sure we're all on the same page. What exactly is Vaishnavism? Well, at its heart, it's a major branch of Hinduism. It all centers around the worship of Vishnu, and especially his avatars like Krishna as the supreme being. And the core idea is that bhakti, or pure devotion, is the ultimate path to salvation. Now, the critique we're examining today, well, it doesn't pull any punches. It makes a really bold claim that if you take a close look at Vaishnavism's foundational texts, you'll find a whole host of factual inaccuracies, logical fallacies, and pretty serious ethical problems that, it argues, shake the faith to its very core.
So here's our roadmap. We're going to break this analysis down into three main parts. First, the challenge to the texts themselves. Then, we'll look at the challenge to its logic. And finally, the challenge to its very sources of knowledge, before we see what the final verdict is.
Okay, first up, the challenge to the texts. This is where the critique really puts foundational scriptures like the Bhagavad Gita and the Bhagavata Purana right under the microscope, asking some tough questions about their factual accuracy and their ethical teachings. All right, so the critique kicks things off by pointing to narratives that it calls factually and scientifically implausible. For instance, you have the famous story of Krishna lifting Govardhana Hill. From a modern scientific perspective, there's just no empirical way to verify that. The argument here is that these kinds of miraculous events and cosmological claims are in direct conflict with our understanding of, the laws of physics. And then the critique moves on to raise some pretty serious ethical questions. It flags the justification of warfare in the Bhagavad Gita and points to stories about Krishna's interactions with the gopis as being, let's say, morally ambiguous by today's standards. And a huge point it makes is that the texts can be seen to reinforce the caste system, the Varnashrama Dharma, which has been used to justify social inequality for a very long time. This all brings us to a really fundamental conflict over the text's integrity. You see, on one hand, followers believe these scriptures are the infallible, divine word of God, period. But on the other hand, the critique points to a ton of scholarly work suggesting they were actually written by multiple authors, edited and revised over many centuries. This suggests a very human influence, not necessarily divine perfection. So, after questioning the texts themselves, the critique shifts gears and turns to the logic behind the beliefs. The core argument here is that many of the theological arguments are basically built on shaky ground, that they're full of logical fallacies that seriously weaken their claims to truth. According to the analysis, the theology is just riddled with these fallacies, and one of the biggest offenders is circular reasoning. This is when your argument basically assumes the very thing it's trying to prove. It's a logical loop that just goes around and around without ever proving anything new. And here's the perfect example given in the critique: the claim that the Bhagavad Gita is infallible because it's the word of God. See how that's circular? You have to already believe it's divinely revealed to accept that it's infallible. The premise and the conclusion are the same thing. Another key fallacy the critique calls out is the appeal to authority. This is the idea that something must be true simply because a respected figure, like Krishna or an ancient sage, said it was. It relies on the status of the person, not on any independent evidence to back up the claim. But wait, there's more. The critique identifies a whole bunch of other fallacies at play. You've got the false dichotomy, which reduces complex issues to a simple either-or choice. There's special pleading, where you apply one set of rules for your own beliefs, like accepting miracles, but a different set for everyone else's. And of course, the classic appeal to tradition, the idea that something must be right just because it's been around for a long time. So this all leads us to the third and final challenge. After picking apart the texts and the logic, the critique asks an even deeper, more fundamental question. How does Vaishnavism claim to know what is true in the first place? And that question, how can we know what is true? That's really the heart of this final argument. It's what's known as an epistemological critique. And that's just a fancy way of asking, how do we know what we claim to know? Are our sources of truth actually reliable? The analysis lays out the three primary ways Vaishnavism establishes truth. First, there's the authority of the sacred scriptures themselves. Second, there are personal revelations, those direct spiritual experiences people have. And third, you have the teachings passed down from spiritual leaders, or gurus.
But here's the thing. The critique argues that none of these sources are really sound. Scriptural authority. It's inherently unverifiable. It ultimately relies on faith, not evidence. Personal revelation? Well, that's deeply subjective and can't be confirmed or tested by anyone else. And spiritual leaders? Their teachings hinge on the credibility of individuals who are, at the end of the day, human and fallible.
So, where does this all take us? The critique now brings all three of these challenges together: the issues with the texts, the flawed logic, and the questionable sources of knowledge, to deliver its final, overarching verdict.
And the final verdict is incredibly blunt. The critique concludes that, taken together, these flaws render the entire belief system fundamentally erroneous. It's a sweeping judgment, claiming the system is factually inaccurate, logically unsound, and built on an unreliable foundation of knowledge.
The source material makes its final judgment in these incredibly stark terms. It argues that without any verifiable evidence to support its claims, the entire system should be considered nothing more than mere superstition and speculation.
And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. A deep dive critique like this one, even though it's focused on a specific faith, inevitably raises a much broader question that really applies to all of us. What standards of evidence should we use when we evaluate any system of belief, whether it's spiritual or something else entirely?